Kendrick Thomas stormed into the courtroom, his heart racing, fists clenched. The echo of his footsteps reverberated off the cold marble floor as he locked eyes with the man responsible for his wrongful conviction, the prosecutor. A 36% longer sentence for the same crime. The system had stolen years of his life, and today, Kendrick wasn't here to sit quietly. He was here to fight back. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" Kendrick spat, the words cutting through the tense silence like a knife. His voice was raw with years of injustice. "Well, I'm coming for everything you took from me." The prosecutor sneered, but Kendrick's lawyer, barely holding it together, whispered, "This is it. The California Racial Justice Act. It's our only shot." Kendrick took a deep breath, every inch of him poised for what was about to come. The stakes couldn't be higher, but the courtroom felt like a battlefield, with everything on the line. His past, his future, his freedom. But would the system let him win? Or would the same old biases crush him again? The courtroom fell silent. All eyes were on Kendrick. For years, he had been just another number, just another statistic in a broken system. But today, everything was different. He wasn't backing down anymore. Not for anyone. The judge, a stern-faced man with a history of tough sentences, raised his gavel. Kendrick's lawyer, Sarah Bishop, stepped forward, her voice steady but strained. "Your Honor, we're here to challenge the fairness of Mr. Thomas's sentence, a sentence that is disproportionately longer than his white counterparts for the same crime. We believe it is a result of racial bias." The prosecutor, an older man with a cold stare, stood up. "This is a waste of the court's time, Your Honor. The law is clear. There's no room for speculation or personal opinion." His words dripped with disdain, as if Kendrick's entire case didn't even deserve a moment's consideration. Kendrick felt the familiar sting of rage creeping up his spine. The same system that had locked him away for years was now trying to bury his fight for justice under layers of red tape and legal jargon. They didn't want to hear his truth, but he wasn't about to be silenced. Sarah turned to Kendrick, her eyes filled with both sympathy and determination. "We can do this, Kendrick. We have to. For you, for everyone who suffered in the system." Kendrick nodded, his jaw clenched. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were forces at play far more powerful than he could imagine, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was finally being heard. The prosecutor smirked, as if already certain of the outcome. He had been part of this unjust system for decades, and he didn't plan on letting one man's fight disrupt it all. But Kendrick wasn't backing down. Not today. As the judge called for a brief recess, Kendrick found himself alone with his thoughts, his future hanging in the balance. The weight of his years in prison, the constant racial bias, all of it crashed down on him. He had spent too long feeling like a victim. But now, for the first time, he was ready to fight for his freedom, and for the freedom of everyone who had been crushed under the same unjust system. The hallway outside the courtroom was empty, save for the muffled sounds of voices from distant rooms. Kendrick leaned against the cold wall, closed his eyes for a moment. The memories of the prison cell came flooding back. The stifling air, the hours of isolation, the anger that burned his chest every day. He'd been locked up for far too long. The years had blurred together, each day blending into the next. But the one thing that remained clear was his fight for justice. He wouldn't let that go. His lawyer's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Kendrick, we've got a shot at this. I know it doesn't seem like it right now, but if we can prove racial bias in sentencing, we have a real chance to overturn this." He looked at Sarah, the only person who believed in him when no one else would. Her face was tired, worn from years of battling against a system that seemed to favor the powerful over the powerless. But Sarah wasn't giving up either. She had seen the injustice firsthand. She knew how hard Kendrick had fought just to get here. "We're in this together," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the world on her shoulders. Kendrick straightened up, ready for whatever was next. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the countless others who had been buried under the same broken system, the ones who had never had a chance to speak up, the ones whose voices had been silenced for far too long. As they returned to the courtroom, Kendrick could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The prosecutor's smug smile never wavered, but Kendrick saw through it. He wasn't intimidated anymore. Not by him, not by the system. The judge called the court back to order, and the battle resumed. This wasn't just about proving Kendrick's innocence. It was about challenging the very foundation of the system that had wronged him and so many others. It was about tearing down the walls of injustice that had been built up over decades. But there was still so much at stake. This wasn't going to be easy. The doors slammed shut behind him, and the tension in the air was palpable. As Kendrick stepped forward, he realized this fight was bigger than he ever imagined. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Kendrick and his legal team prepared for the next round. The judge, unmoved by the dramatic opening statements, glanced at his notes before looking up at the prosecutor with an expression of indifference. The old man stood with his usual air of confidence, the years of winning cases easily under his belt. But today was different. Today, Kendrick was fighting back. "This is ridiculous," the prosecutor muttered, his voice low enough that only the judge could hear. "We've dealt with this racial justice nonsense before. It's just another play for leniency." Kendrick's fists clenched as he sat beside Sarah, his mind racing. Every word from the prosecutor felt like a slap across his face. He had been branded a criminal, and now they were going to dismiss the very law that could give him a chance at redemption? Sarah glanced at Kendrick, her face betraying the exhaustion she had hidden so well up until now. The weight of the case, the hours of preparation, the sleepless nights, was taking its toll. But there was no room for doubt. Not now, not when they were so close. "Your Honor, we're asking for a fair review," Sarah argued, her voice steady despite the pressure mounting against her. "The California Racial Justice Act allows us to examine racial bias in sentencing. We are not asking for a free pass. We are asking for fairness, for equality." The judge sighed, clearly unimpressed. "I'm aware of the law, counselor, but you're asking me to rewrite history. The sentencing is what it is." It was like a punch to the gut. Kendrick's entire future was being weighed on the decisions of people who had never walked a day in his shoes. They were blinded by tradition, by the status quo, unable to see the deep-rooted flaws in the very system they were upholding. The prosecutor smirked, sensing a victory in the air. "You can't just retroactively change history. You're looking for something that doesn't exist." Sarah's face hardened. She wasn't about to let the system break Kendrick. Not now. Not after all they had fought for. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years of injustice. "This is not just about Kendrick Thomas. This is about all the people who have been sentenced unfairly because of their race. It's about making sure that what happened to him, what happened to so many others, doesn't continue." The prosecutor scoffed. How convenient. A sudden moral awakening after years of complacency. The words stung, but Kendrick wasn't ready to let them slide. His eyes locked with the prosecutor's, the anger that had simmered for years bubbling up to the surface. He couldn't stay silent anymore, not when this man, this entire system, had wronged him and so many others. "You're wrong," Kendrick said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "You're not fighting for justice. You're fighting to protect the lies you've built this system on. And I'm not going to let you keep hiding behind your badge, behind your position. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone you've crushed with your bias." The words hung in the air, echoing through the courtroom. Kendrick's voice had broken through the noise, but now the question remained. Would anyone listen? The prosecutor's smirk faltered for just a moment, but it was enough. Kendrick could see the cracks forming, the walls of resistance beginning to break. It was only a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Sarah caught his eye and gave him a small nod of approval. He wasn't just a man in a courtroom anymore. He was a symbol of all the injustice that had been swept under the rug for far too long. But as the case continued, the stakes grew higher. The prosecutor wasn't about to go down without a fight. The resistance was only beginning, and Kendrick knew the road ahead would be even harder. But the fire inside him had been lit. He wouldn't back down now. The hearing broke for lunch, but as Kendrick stood up, a cold chill ran down his spine. He hadn't anticipated the level of pushback, but it was becoming clear. The system was not going to let him win easily. And this battle, it wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about dismantling the very foundations of a corrupt and biased system that had been in place for far too long. Outside the courtroom, Sarah paced back and forth, her mind working through every angle. She had expected resistance, but the prosecutor's arrogance, his dismissive attitude toward the very law that could help Kendrick, was more than she had anticipated. She had hoped for a smoother fight, but that hope was fading quickly. "You know, it's never been this bad," she muttered to herself. "It's always been hard, but this feels personal." Kendrick caught up to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We've come too far to turn back now," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of what they were up against. "We fight until the very end." Sarah met his gaze, her eyes hardening with resolve. "We fight, yes, but we need something more than just hope. We need proof. Something that shows a systemic bias. Something concrete." Kendrick nodded. He knew the challenge was monumental, but he couldn't stop now. Not when there were so many people, so many families, who needed this fight to succeed. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been wronged by the system. Everyone who had ever been treated differently because of the color of their skin. As they sat down to prepare for the next round of the trial, the door to the courtroom opened, and a new figure walked in, a man Kendrick didn't recognize. He was dressed in a dark suit, but there was something about him that seemed out of place. Kendrick's eyes narrowed. This could be the breakthrough they needed, or it could be the final piece of the puzzle that would end the case before it even started. The courtroom doors shut behind them, and Kendrick felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. A new player had entered the scene, and the question was, would he help, or would he make everything even more complicated? The break ended with an uneasy silence hanging in the air. Kendrick and his lawyer, Sarah, returned to their seats as the court reconvened. But as they walked through the door, something had changed. The energy in the room was different. It was palpable. Kendrick's eyes flicked to the new figure, a man in a sharp suit, sitting across from the prosecutor. He was older, his hair gray at the temples, but there was something about him that suggested experience, wisdom, perhaps even a sense of authority. Kendrick's heart skipped a beat. Who was this man, and what was his role in this fight? The judge called the court to order, and the new figure stood up, adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor, my name is Martin Westbrook. I'm here as an expert in judicial disparities, and I've been asked to consult on this case regarding systemic racial bias in sentencing." Sarah's eyes widened slightly in surprise. Kendrick could feel the hope flicker inside him, but it was faint. Was this the breakthrough they had been praying for? The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "An expert in bias?" he scoffed. "What's next? A fortune teller?" Westbrook didn't flinch. "What I'm offering is not speculation, but documented history," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "The evidence shows that racial disparities in sentencing have been prevalent for decades. It's not just about one case. It's about the larger system that continues to harm individuals like Mr. Thomas." Kendrick leaned forward, his breath quickening. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. The moment where the very biases that had held him captive would be laid bare. The prosecutor shot back. "This is a waste of time. There's no direct evidence that Mr. Thomas's sentence was racially motivated. What you're proposing is an emotional argument, not a legal one." But Westbrook didn't back down. He turned to the judge. "If you look at the data, real data, you will see the patterns. African-American defendants, on average, are sentenced more harshly than their white counterparts. And that's not speculation. That's fact." The room fell silent. For the first time, there was a shift in the air. Kendrick's pulse raced. This wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about the entire system. His case had become the tipping point. Sarah stood, feeling the weight of the moment. "Your Honor, we request that Mr. Westbrook's expert testimony be allowed to stand. His insights could provide the proof we need to show that Mr. Thomas's sentence was part of a larger, deeply rooted issue." The judge remained quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting between the opposing sides. Kendrick could see the tension in his eyes, the uncertainty of whether or not to allow such an explosive argument to take hold. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge nodded. "I will allow the testimony. But be advised, this case is already teetering on the edge of the extraordinary. Proceed with caution." Kendrick let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It wasn't a victory yet, But it was a breakthrough, a crack in the door that had been firmly shut in his face for so long. As Westbrook took the stand, he began to speak with a quiet authority that commanded attention. He pulled up data on the courtroom screens, showing graphs and figures that illustrated the disparities in sentencing between black and white defendants. Kendrick watched, spellbound. He hadn't expected a miracle, but this was the evidence he needed. This data, Westbrook explained, is from over 50 years of judicial history. It shows that black defendants are not only more likely to be sentenced to longer terms, but they are also more likely to receive harsher sentences for the same crimes. This pattern is undeniable. The prosecutor, now visibly frustrated, stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence is based on generalizations not specific to this case." But Westbrook didn't flinch. "Your Honor, if this case isn't a perfect example of systemic bias, I don't know what is. Mr. Thomas's case is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger issue that needs to be addressed." Kendrick's heart surged with hope. For the first time, it felt like the truth was finally being spoken out loud. The system, the one that had wronged him, that had kept him in chain for years, was being exposed. This was his moment. The moment where the entire structure could crumble beneath the weight of its own prejudice. But as Westbrook continued his testimony, Kendrick's mind raced. This wasn't just about his freedom anymore. This was about something much larger. This was about the countless other individuals, the thousands of men and women who had been sentenced unfairly, whose voices had been silenced. But as the evidence piled up, so did the pressure. The prosecutor was relentless, throwing every argument he could muster to discredit Westbrook's findings. The fight was far from over. Sarah turned to Kendrick, her eyes filled with both exhaustion and determination. "This is it, Kendrick. This is the chance we've been waiting for. But it's not going to be easy. We have to keep pushing." Kendrick nodded, his fists tightening once more. This wasn't just about him. This was for everyone who had ever been judged based on the color of their skin. The hearing broke for the day, and as Kendrick walked back to the holding room, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. This was the beginning of something bigger. This was the start of a movement, a fight for justice that could change everything. But just as hope flickered on the horizon, a chilling thought crossed Kendrick's mind. If the system had been this resistant to change for so long, how much longer could they hold out? The courtroom was quieter now. The arguments, the statistics, the expert testimony, they had all set the stage for the inevitable clash. And it was coming. Kendrick could feel the tension building, a storm about to break. But what he didn't expect was a sudden shift in the prosecutor's demeanor. The smugness that had been present for days now seemed to have evaporated. The prosecutor, Mark Hollis, had been at the top of his game for decades, known for his unflinching support of the system. He was never shaken. But as he turned to face the jury and then back to the judge, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Kendrick wasn't sure if he was imagining it, but for the first time, Hollis seemed rattled. "Your Honor," Hollis began, his voice steady but laced with thin veneer of frustration. "This case has gone too far. The evidence Mr. Westbrook provided is not just flawed. It's irrelevant to the facts of this case. Mr. Thomas was sentenced based on the law and the facts surrounding his offense, not his race." Kendrick clenched his jaw, the fury building inside him. For years, he had sat in a cell, living the injustice day by day. And now, here was this man, this prosecutor, denying what was right in front of him, denying everything Kendrick had fought for. The law wasn't blind. It had seen his skin color first. "We've been through this already," Hollis continued. "The law doesn't change based on who you are. We cannot let personal opinions and social causes cloud the legal process." Kendrick stood up, his heart pounding. The moment had arrived. He wasn't going to let this man dictate his life anymore. He had to speak up. He had to make them listen. "Your Honor, I am more than just a statistic," Kendrick said, his voice cutting through the prosecutor's words like a knife. "I'm not just another black man in a prison cell. I'm a human being. I have a life, a family, a future, and it's been stolen because of the color of my skin. You say it's irrelevant, but it's everything. It's the reason I've spent years locked away. It's the reason I'm here today." The room fell silent. Kendrick's words hung in the air, heavier than the gavel that would soon fall. Hollis's face turned a shade darker, but it wasn't just anger that clouded his features now. It was something deeper, something Kendrick had seen in other men who knew they were losing control. Fear. He wasn't just up against a man anymore. He was up against a movement. Sarah stood up beside Kendrick, her voice unwavering. Mr. Hollis is correct about one thing. This is bigger than just one case. But what you're not hearing is that this case isn't isolated. It's a part of a larger pattern that has been ignored for far too long. Mr. Thomas's sentence is an example of how the system has failed time and time again, and it's time to change that. Hollis shot a glare at Sarah, his voice growing louder. You're twisting the law to fit your narrative, counselor. The law is about facts, not feelings. If we start down this road of changing sentences based on personal experiences, we'll have chaos, and that's not something we can allow. But it was clear that the damage was done. The momentum had shifted. The jury, who had remained mostly silent to the majority of the trial, were now leaning in, their eyes flicking between Kendrick and Hollis. They were listening. They were paying attention. It was then that the true weight of the moment hit Kendrick. This wasn't just about a legal case anymore. This was about a reckoning. The system, the one that had locked him away for so long, was finally being forced to confront its own flaws. And Kendrick was right at the heart of it. But just as he began to feel the shift, just as a glimmer of hope began to shine brighter, the judge interrupted. Enough, Judge Devereux said, his voice cutting through the tension. He looked from the jury to the prosecutor and then back at Kendrick. We've heard enough arguments for now. It's time to review the evidence and prepare for closing statements. This case will be adjourned until tomorrow morning. Kendrick's chest tightened. He had hoped for a breakthrough, for the scales of justice to tip in his favor, but this felt like another delay, another wall that was being built in front of him, just when he thought he was making progress. The gavel came down with sharp, echoing bang, and the courtroom emptied as quickly as it had filled. Kendrick's heart was still pounding as he walked out, his thoughts racing. He wasn't sure if he could take much more of this. The uncertainty, the delays, the constant pushback from a system that had been built to protect the powerful and silence the powerless. Outside, the cold air hit him like a slap to the face. The weight of the day's events hung heavily around his shoulders. He was closer than ever to the truth, but every step forward felt like it came at the cost of 1,000 more battles. Are you okay? Sarah asked as she caught up to him. He nodded, though the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. I'm fine, but it's not over. Not yet. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of understanding. She knew how much this meant to Kendrick. She knew how much it meant to everyone who had been wronged by the system. But she also knew that no victory was ever easy. Not when you were fighting a battle this big. Kendrick glanced back at the courthouse doors, the heavy weight of what was to come still pressing on his chest. He wasn't sure if the next round of arguments would tip the scales in his favor, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The fight had only just begun, and the next day would bring new challenges, new twists that could either push him closer to justice or drag him back into the darkness. But Kendrick Thomas wasn't backing down. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Kendrick, the tension thick in the air. It had been a restless night. The weight of the last few days hung heavily on him, and the thought of the next day's proceedings made his stomach twist in knots. But despite the anxiety, there was one thing Kendrick knew for sure. This fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Kendrick was back in the courtroom, his lawyer, Sarah, standing firm beside him. It was clear from the moment they walked in that the stakes had risen. The prosecutor, Hollis, sat with an air of determination, a quiet confidence returning to his demeanor, as if the previous day's cracks in his armor had been sealed. Your Honor, Hollis began, his voice cold but controlled, I've heard enough of this misplaced outrage. There's no concrete evidence linking Mr. Thomas's sentence to racial bias. This is simply a smokescreen, a desperate attempt to rewrite history. Sarah stood up, her face etched with resolve. Your Honor, we presented the evidence. We presented the data. We've shown you that this case is not just about Kendrick Thomas. It's about every single person who's been wronged by the system. Every person who has suffered because of the color of their skin. The judge's gavel came down sharply, but his eyes were focused on the prosecutor. This is the last time I remind you, Mr. Hollis. No more distractions. Present your closing arguments. The air grew thick with anticipation. Kendrick could feel it. The suffocating pressure, the knowledge that everything would come down to this moment, the final arguments. As Hollis began his closing remarks, Kendrick's thoughts drifted to the years of his life that had been stolen, the friends he would never see again, the family moments he had missed, the potential that had been locked away behind bars. The anger surged again, a fire he could no longer contain. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every single person who had ever been overlooked by the system. Hollis's voice echoed in the courtroom. You've heard the arguments. You've seen the data. But what you haven't seen is the real truth. Mr. Thomas was sentenced based on his actions, not the color of his skin. To suggest otherwise is to undermine everything this country stands for. Kendrick's jaw tightened. It was the same tired argument, the same refusal to acknowledge the reality of racial bias in the system. But this time, it wasn't going to work. Not when the truth was staring them all in the face. Hollis continued, now focusing on the jury. You were not brought here to make a political statement. You are here to uphold the law. And the law is clear. Mr. Thomas is guilty, and he deserves a sentence. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence, the weight of Hollis's words hanging in the air. Kendrick's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood tall. He couldn't let this be the end. Not after everything he had endured. Sarah stepped forward to deliver the closing rebuttal. Her voice was calm, but there was a steel in it that Kendrick hadn't heard before. Your Honor, the law is not just about punishment. It's about fairness. It's about equality. And for too long, our justice system has failed to deliver that equality, especially when it comes to people of color. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Kendrick Thomas was sentenced to a longer prison term simply because of the color of his skin. The facts are undeniable. The evidence is clear. And we cannot, in good conscience, ignore that. What we are asking for is simple justice. We are asking you to look at this case not as a single trial, but as part of a larger issue that demands to be addressed. The prosecutor scoffed, but the room was different now. The jury was paying attention. The judge, though still stoic, seemed more engaged than he had been the entire trial. Sarah's voice grew stronger. The California Racial Justice Act was passed because we recognize that racial bias has no place in our legal system. Mr. Thomas's case is not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of a much larger problem. And today, we ask for the chance to correct that. Kendrick couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time in the entire trial, he felt like they were actually being heard. It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about the moral imperative to right the wrongs that had been done to him and countless others. But just as the hope began to rise, a familiar voice interrupted the proceedings. I object. A voice rang out from the back of the room. Kendrick's stomach dropped. He recognized the voice immediately. It was Vincent Lawrence, the man who had been the prosecutor in his original case. The man who had been part of the corrupt system that had sent him to prison. He had been quietly observing the trial from the back, but now he was stepping forward, his face shadowed with a sense of authority that Kendrick remembered all too well. Lawrence had been the one to paint him as a criminal from the very beginning, the one who had made sure Kendrick's life was thrown away without a second thought. What is this? The judge asked, clearly surprised by Lawrence's sudden intervention. I'm here to set the record straight, Lawrence said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet venom. Kendrick Thomas's case has nothing to do with racial bias. This is a man who was convicted for his actions, for his behavior. If you open the door for this kind of revisionism, then what's next? Every criminal will ask for their sentence to be overturned based on their race. The courtroom fell silent, the air growing colder. Kendrick's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Lawrence. This was the moment he had feared, the moment where the system would try to crush him again. But now, Kendrick had something he hadn't had before, the truth, the support of his lawyer, and the strength to keep fighting. Sarah turned to face Lawrence, her expression one of both resolve and contempt. Mr. Lawrence, With all due respect, you don't get to define justice anymore. You've had your chance, and it's time for the truth to come out. Kendrick felt a surge of power in that moment. The final showdown had arrived. The stakes were higher than ever, but he was no longer just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for every person who had been oppressed by the very system that was now attempting to silence him. The judge's gavel fell. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind him as Kendrick walked out, his mind spinning with the realization that the fight had reached its boiling point. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new twists, and a decision that would change everything. The following day, Kendrick stood outside the courthouse, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets as the cold wind whipped around him. The events of the past few weeks seemed to blur together. The legal wrangling, the long nights, the endless battles. But one thing was crystal clear. His fight was no longer just his own. It had become a movement, a national conversation about racial justice in the courtroom. The news outlets were camped outside, cameras flashing as reporters shoved microphones in Kendrick's face. Kendrick, do you think the judge will rule in your favor? Do you believe the system will finally listen to your claims of racial bias? Kendrick didn't answer right away. He had learned long ago that words could be twisted, used against him. So instead, he walked past a crowd of reporters, his eyes focused ahead, determined not to let this moment slip away. The cameras followed him, but the weight of the moment hung over him like a cloud. His lawyer, Sarah, walked beside him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. They're watching you, Kendrick. They're listening. He nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The pressure, the weight of every person who had ever been wronged by the system, was now his burden to carry. But Kendrick was no longer afraid. He was ready for whatever came next. Inside the courthouse, the judge had called for a final hearing. The atmosphere was tense as everyone took their seats. The air was thick with anticipation. No one knew exactly how the judge would rule, but everyone knew this case had become a symbol of something much bigger than just one man's fight for justice. As the proceedings began, it was clear that the case had drawn the attention of powerful figures from across the country. Civil rights activists, legal experts, and even lawmakers were watching closely, waiting for the judge's decision. The courtroom was packed, with members of the press filling every available seat, their cameras ready to capture the moment. Judge Devereux took his seat, his face grim. We have all heard the arguments. We have seen the evidence. Now it is time for the court to make its ruling. Kendrick's heart hammered in his chest. His entire future rested on the next few minutes. But even more than that, the future of countless others who had suffered through the same injustices was in the balance. This case had become a turning point, a chance to right the wrongs that had been done for centuries. The judge looked at Kendrick, then at the prosecutor, Hollis. He had listened to the arguments, weighed the evidence, and now he was ready to make his decision. The court has reviewed the findings of the California Racial Justice Act, the expert testimony provided, and the evidence presented by both sides. It is clear that systemic racial bias in sentencing is not only a real issue, but a significant one that must be addressed. Kendrick's pulse raced. Was this the moment? Was this the breakthrough they had been waiting for? The judge continued, his voice steady. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of the defendant, Kendrick Thomas. His sentence will be reconsidered in light of the evidence of racial bias. This case is a wake-up call for the entire judicial system. We can no longer ignore the patterns of discrimination that have plagued our courts for far too long. A gasp swept through the courtroom. Kendrick's heart skipped a beat as the reality of the judge's ruling sank in. This was it. This was the moment when justice had finally been served, not just for him, but for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. But the battle wasn't over. As the judge's ruling echoed through the courtroom, Kendrick turned to see Hollis's face twist into a mask of fury. The prosecutor didn't even attempt to hide his rage. He had lost, and the weight of that loss was crushing. You may have won this round, Mr. Thomas, Hollis sneered, his voice low and filled with venom. But this isn't the end. You're making a dangerous mistake if you think this is the last time you'll face me. Kendrick met his gaze, refusing to flinch. The only mistake I made was staying silent for so long. But not anymore. Not ever again. Sarah placed a hand on Kendrick's shoulder, her expression a mixture of relief and resolve. You did it. You fought. And you won. But even as Kendrick absorbed the weight of the victory, a part of him knew the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Outside the courthouse, the crowds had gathered. The streets were filled with people holding signs, chanting for justice, for reform. Kendrick's case had sparked something much bigger than he'd ever imagined. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a rallying cry for those who had been silenced, for those who had been crushed under the weight of racial injustice. Kendrick walked out into the sunlight, his steps steady but his mind racing. The cameras flashed, but this time he didn't shy away. He had been given a platform. He had been given a voice. A reporter shoved a microphone in front of him, but Kendrick didn't hesitate. This fight isn't just about me. This is about every person who has ever been treated unfairly. Every person who has been judged not by their actions, but by the color of their skin. We need change, and we're going to get it. The crowd erupted into applause, and Kendrick felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. This was the beginning of a movement that would push back against the system, that would demand accountability, and that would ensure that no one else would have to suffer as he had. But even as he walked through the crowd, there was one thought that kept gnawing at the back of his mind. If they could do this to me, how many others were still locked in the system, waiting for their chance to be heard? The battle was won, but the war had just begun. Kendrick stood at the steps of the courthouse, his heart still racing from the ruling he'd just received. The cheers of the crowd around him were deafening, but inside, a quiet storm was brewing. He had won, for now, but this was only the beginning. The weight of the journey, the years of injustice, the countless hours spent locked away in a cell, pressed on his chest. He'd thought that freedom would be the end of the fight, but now he realized that his real battle was only starting. The system that had wronged him was vast, powerful, and insidious, and it wasn't going to give up without a fight. Kendrick's eyes scanned the sea of faces in the crowd, activists, lawmakers, reporters, and supporters who had followed his case from the beginning. They were all there, cheering him on, but Kendrick knew that the real victory wasn't in the court's decision. The real victory was in the movement he had helped ignite. "This isn't just about me," Kendrick said into the microphone, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about everyone who has been treated unfairly by the system. This is about justice for all. We've taken the first step, but there's so much more to do. We can't stop here. We won't stop here." The crowd erupted into applause again, but Kendrick's mind was already racing. The case had brought attention to the issue of racial bias in sentencing, but had also exposed the cracks in the entire judicial system. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was a wake-up call. It was proof that the system could be challenged and changed, but it also highlighted just how much work was still needed. As Kendrick finished his speech and stepped away from the microphone, a familiar face appeared in the crowd. It was Sarah, his lawyer, the woman who had stood by him through every battle. Her eyes were bright with pride, but also with a deep sense of understanding. She knew what Kendrick was feeling. "You did it," Sarah said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You really did it." Kendrick nodded but didn't say anything. There was too much on his mind, too much work ahead. He had become the face of a movement. But what came next? Where did they go from here? "We did it," Kendrick finally replied. "But it's not over. Not by a long shot." Sarah smiled, her eyes glinting with determination. "You've opened the door. Now we walk through it together." As they walked back toward the crowd, Kendrick noticed something he hadn't expected. People were no longer just looking at him. They were looking at each other. They were talking, exchanging numbers, making plans. What had begun as a fight for Kendrick's freedom had transformed into a full-blown movement for change, a movement for justice. In the weeks that followed, Kendrick became a national figure. His case was discussed on news outlets, in social media feeds, in university classrooms, and in legislative chambers. The California Racial Justice Act, which had been passed in response to his case, became the catalyst for nationwide reforms in sentencing laws. States across the country began to reassess their own sentencing practices, and grassroots organizations began pushing for further changes to a broken system. But despite the national attention, the accolades, Kendrick remained focused on one thing: the people, the men and women who, like him, had been lost in the system, the people who had never had the chance to speak up, who had never been given a platform to tell their stories. One day, Kendrick found himself back in the same courthouse, but this time it wasn't to face a judge. It was to speak to a group of young people. People who, like him, had been at the mercy of a biased system. He stood before them, his heart full, his resolve stronger than ever. "You don't have to accept the way things are," Kendrick said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You don't have to stay silent. I didn't. And look at where we are now. We've started something. But this is just the beginning. We have a long road ahead of us, and I need you to walk it with me." The room was silent as the young people listened to Kendrick. They were hungry for change, just like he had been, and they had the power to make it happen. As Kendrick finished his speech and walked out of the courthouse for the last time, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he knew that they were on the right path. The road ahead would be long, but they were no longer fighting alone. They had the support of a movement, the backing of the people, and most importantly, they had the truth on their side. Kendrick turned to look back at the courthouse one last time. He had been through so much to get here, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The system had failed him once, but it would never fail him again. He was no longer a prisoner of the system. He was its challenger. And as long as there was breath in his lungs, Kendrick Thomas would fight for justice. For himself, for everyone who had been wronged, and for a future where no one would have to suffer like he had. Kendrick's journey taught him the power of standing up against systemic injustice. The road to reform was not easy, but the courage to speak out and the strength to fight, both individually and as part of a larger movement, could bring about lasting change. His story was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person could make a difference. And just like that, Kendrick Thomas walked away from the courthouse, not as a victim, but as a hero, a man who had changed the course of history. His fight for justice was far from over, but it had set in motion a movement that would echo through generations to come. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're tuning in from. If you enjoyed today's story, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another heart-pounding cinematic tale from Black Justice Tales. Here's a quick question for you. Would you have made the same decision if you were in Kendrick's shoes, standing up against a system that had wronged you? What would you do if you had the chance to change the system for good? Kendrick's story is proof that no matter how hard the fight, standing up for what's right can change the world. What change are you fighting for?